All right, we are going to get started here.
Alrighty.
Good afternoon and welcome to the Osterville Village Library. My name is Amy Wolf. I'm the programming director here at the OVL. Thank you so much for joining us today. And to our friends joining us on Zoom, thank you for being here as well. Today we have the honor of introducing Jennifer Burke, the Director of Education for the Submarine Force Museum in Groton, Connecticut, visiting us all the way up here in Cape Cod. And she brings with her a thrilling historical program, The History of Submarines. Throughout her career, she has spent time teaching preschool, working with the National Park Service in their interpretive division, and has worked for 5 years with the Navy's Museum, providing educational and family programming. So let's give Jen Burke a warm welcome, because she made the trek in the rain today.
It's an honor to be here with you. Now, when you hear the word submarine, what kind of pops into your brain? What do you think of when you hear the word submarine? Ah, Jules Verne. Yeah, what else do you think of? World War II. The novelist. Claustrophobia, yeah, definitely. And you bring out a good point, because do you think everyone can deal with it? No. No, so basically, when we're looking at how this all came about, we're looking at the fact that for these men, some came from just an idea, others it would really take time as they worked trying to get through each portion.
Your clicker.
Okay. So when we look at how many of you have ever been to different museums that have had different types of wooden ships or been to, okay. When we look at the fact that we do have, over time, we've gone from wooden to metal, why would a submarine be more efficient than, let's say, a landing ship carrier? No. No. Yeah. What else? Yeah. So when we look at submarines, we're also looking at, yeah, the stealth, the weather that they can be in, and what can they be used for? That's one, what's another? Yeah. So we can use those for a variety. And so when we look at, who would be the most interested in them, we're really looking at how do they help us in understanding our surroundings? How do they help us militarily? Because the more we know of our surroundings, how does that help us? So the first guy we're going to look at is a gentleman named David Bushnell. And he actually is going to be the first one to come up with what he called the turtle. During the time of the American Revolution, you have the fact that the British are the best navy in the world. And the US knows they can't really go up against. So what the colonists will do is they'll have Bushnell create what he calls the turtle. It's got basically pedals here that he can push up and down. And then at night, what he'll do is he'll go up to the British ships, drill into the side and put one of his little mines. And then he just goes away and the ship sinks. But here's the problem. What happens when wooden ships have been in the ocean a long time? What grows on them? Yeah, barnacles, algae, all that good stuff. So he couldn't drill in. But he did show that, yeah, I can, Bushnell was like, all right, my machine worked. It's not totally what I needed it to be. And of course, as time goes by, what will happen is there'll be other attempts at building submersibles. But unfortunately, they don't work out. And so the three men we're really going to focus today on is Bushnell, because yes, his machine did work. So it was able to survive going up to the British ships, because the drill wasn't sharp enough to do what it needed to do. But another gentleman.
How many of those were deployed?
These, just one, just the turtle. Yeah, unfortunately, it was lost. We don't know where it went to, but. Yeah, what David Bushnell did do is he with the mines that he created, he will actually continue to work on those so that during Washington's encampment at Valley Forge, they actually dumped a bunch of those mines in the Schuylkill River. So the British were leaving, going and going up, they picked those mines and the ships would sink. So in a lot of ways, people have said that when you look at what Bushnell was really doing, he's kind of like the father of the Army Corps with all of his designs and whatnot. So the next gentleman is Simon Lake. He comes much later in time. In the 1880s and 90s, there had been other attempts at submarine building. They did not fare well. Simon Lake is actually the first to really not only get these submarines up and working, but he actually really opened the doors to understanding what scientifically is under the water. Because how much of the ocean do we really understand today? Not a lot. Yeah, about 5%. So what Simon does is he will create his invention called the Argonaut. Wanna take a look, pass those around. These are just different things Simon has created. But one of the things is, why would Simon want to put wheels on a submarine? Hmm?
To get it to the work,
Yeah, what else?
stability.
Yeah, what he does is he goes to the bottom of the Chesapeake Bay. he creates an area that allows the water or allows the air to push up against a door so he can actually open it and walk out on the bottom of the bay. And so what he's doing is in the 1880s and 90s, he's pretty much one of the first to create a machine that actually does this. And what Simon was really hoping to show was there's a lot for us to understand about our oceans, whether it be medically, scientifically, environmentally, and so he will continue. Another thing that he will do is he will create small vessels that are tiny enough to go into other sunken vessels and to check them out. He will create some vessels that are kind of like a suitcase type where the guys could walk on the bottom and then just put stuff in and send it up. So again, for Simon, it was all about the science, the technology, but in the 1880s and 90s, do you think a lot of people are interested in this? You're correct. The US government was like, okay, that's nice. And other European nations were looking at this and saying, hey, Simon, got an idea for you. There was one country in particular that said to Simon, hey, I see you're building submarines. Could you do it for military instead of science? Think Simon agreed? Yes. Oh, yeah, because whatever he could make from it, he used towards science. So Austria, Simon will build for. What's the country right next to Austria? Germany will be the second country. Now, Simon will also show his military designs to the US Navy. Do they like them? They're absolutely correct. They do not like them. They're like, Simon, no, you got a creative side, just doesn't fit. However, for Simon, as he does continue to build, he will continue to really work with these other nations. So yes, he's building for them militarily, but again, he's putting a lot of this research and everything into really understanding what's going on scientifically. And then what will happen is, Simon is actually the first to create a submarine that has an extendable arm. Why would you want an extendable arm?
You could mine.
You can mine, what else can you do?
Get on.
No. What can you do with an extender? Yeah. Yeah, you can get some samples to understand what's going on in the area. Marine life, plant life that could be used for medicine. And so for Simon, again, for most of his stuff, he's really looking at it from a scientific perspective. But he knows to be able to do that, he's also got to build for the military. So when these nations start contacting him, he will build for them. And through his expertise and everything he did scientifically, today we have our submersibles. So pretty much that's what Simon Lake is really known for, is the fact with all of his work scientifically and so forth. So even though he did build for other nations, those nations will take those ideas, revamp them to their own. So Simon will actually build for Austria, Germany, Russia and Japan. But by this point, this is where the US Navy really starts to get nervous. Because pretty much when submarines started, it was one of those, okay, if it works, it works. If it doesn't, it doesn't. When we look at our builders, like if we were to, when we look at the American Revolution and Bushnell with his submarine, the submersible, it was a success. And the fact that it could work, it could go up to British ships. Unfortunately, it couldn't complete because you have way too many barnacles. So the drill wasn't strong enough to attach the mines to the British ships. But Bushnell proved that you could make something that was, in a sense, submersible. You had others who, during the Civil War, we have the Alligator, didn't work out that well, the Hunley. So when we get to Simon Lake in the 1880s and 90s, he's really the first one to not only make these submarines that are great for scientific purposes, but he's also really showing how they can be used internationally. And what's going to happen is in 1907, between 1907 and 1909, you're going to have the Japanese-Russia War. And that's when submarines are really going to be used. And that was really a wake-up call to the US saying, okay, these things are around. Simon has showed us multiple schematics, but we really don't like his designs. There's got to be something else out there. Because again, they're looking at Simon and they're just saying, okay, you're an average guy. You love the nation. You've got a great inventive side to you. So there's got to be others like you out there that we just haven't tapped into. And so what's going to happen is the Navy will put their heads together and say, okay, what if we were to do a contest? And just say to the general public at large, we are looking for a design that can be used for military purposes. Please send it to us. The Navy will put that forward. When they do get the okay, they'll say, all right. So that's what they're going to do. But for Simon, when we look at his accomplishments, the fact that he was really able to create on a military side a new type of vessel to be used in war at the time was both intriguing and tragic. And so these are just some of the different ones he had built for the European nations. And then on the scientific side of things, Simon's really trying to understand what's going on geographically, marine life, and so forth, is really opening that door, because pretty much his generation, if we know 5% today, how much do you think they knew back then? Yeah. Very little, maybe 0.5%. So he's opening those doors to the scientific community, saying,
What would they build?
when they
Where would they?
Connecticut.
They weren't connected.
Yep. How many of you have ever been to Milford or kind of around Old Saybrook, kind of like heading down that way? Yeah. That's where Simon will have his place, and
Are they building traditional boats? steel hull boats down at that time?
At that time. Mhm. Yep, and then unfortunately, after he passes away, his business will not continue. But if you do go to Milford, Connecticut, you will see the Explorer on display. This was the first submarine to actually have that extendable arm. The Navy won't come up with a submarine with an extendable arm till decades later with what they called the Naval Research Vessel 1. But Simon will definitely be the first. And again, for those who are interested in the sciences and everything, this is really opening the door to that. But unfortunately, at the time he's doing this, it's not really taking hold. It's only till decades later that the research he had been looking at and trying to provide, people would become more excited about. So he was a little ahead of his time for that, unfortunately. But what will happen is, with his designs and everything, again, he's really the first successful one for what we would call more modern time. And you will have other nations stepping up now saying, okay, this is how they're put together. So again, it's sending the navies in a different way. For the
What was his educational background? Was he an engineer?
no,
He wasn't.
nope, he was just an inventor. That he just, education came naturally to him. And as a child, he had read 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, fell in love with that, Treasure Island, and he was like, you know what, there's gotta be more. There's got to be something that we can look at. And it was really just his love of learning that he decided to go forth and do. And with a lot of your inventors, that's just kind of how it is. It's that hidden love, that desire, that yen that really comes forth. Because for the US, by this point, getting around 1909, 1910, that's when our Navy is really waking up and saying, okay, what do we do? Where do we go? So they are going to put out a contest, and in that contest, yeah, you've got John Holland.
US Navy so, blinded because things like the hunting didn't work that well? Why were they so blind when other navies around the world were more proliferate?
So they weren't so much blinded. It was more the fact they just didn't like the design. And you had your definitely more progressive countries like Germany, Austria, Russia, really stepping up to the plate saying, okay, this looks interesting, let's go for it. But you'll have other countries like England that will look at these and say, no, they're undignified. Because when you go to war, you must face your enemy. That's the proper etiquette. So they're gonna just put up their nose and say no thanks. For the US, yeah, it really came down to design. And what's gonna happen, let's see. But for John Holland, what will happen is he will actually see the contest and say, you know what? Why not? So for the Navy, he will send them his design and say, this is the Holland. And at this time, there are 3 things these submarines are gonna be running on. What are those 3 things?
Kerosene.
Not so much kerosene, but gasoline, what else?
Batteries.
Yep, one more.
Human power.
Yeah, so those 3 things are gonna be the most important for these submarines, including some of Simon Lake's as well. It won't be until later where the gasoline will switch over to diesel. But at this time, it's gasoline, battery, and electricity. And for John Holland, the Navy will basically say to him, look, where have you been? We love your designs. Holland will say, well, I'm a teacher. And the Navy says, that's great, you're not teaching anymore, you're building. So John will set up his own shop in New York, and that's where he'll be. And then what's gonna happen is, there's a gentleman named Isaac Rice. Isaac Rice, owns a business called General Dynamics. One of their main products is batteries. Isaac will say to John, hey, look, I know you love designing submarines and you don't like paperwork. I don't mind paperwork and I know you need batteries. So why don't we combine our businesses? Does he agree? Yeah, hence electric boat. So for over 100 years, these are some of the more modern day ones. Electric boat. Has been building for us. Now, the thing is, when you look at the more later designs from the Holland, especially when you get into World War I and World War II, your submarines are still gonna have what would look more like kind of a surface ship. And they'll have the guns on top and so forth, because the thing is, when you're running on gasoline, batteries, and electricity, can you stay underwater for long periods of time? No. 2 days max. So you have to come up to recharge your battery. What about your air? You gotta change the air out. So one thing the Navy knows is when they're in war, what's the one thing you've got to make sure of with your submarines? You're near a port, so if something does go wrong, you can easily get back. Because another thing that the Navy realizes is, what is the likelihood if something were to go wrong? What is the likelihood of your survival? Yeah, pretty much slim to none. There will be attempts to make things like, we know there's a gentleman named McCann. He will try to create a rescue chamber that will go over the hatch, so that the sailors could get out. Because the hatch would, the implement would be over the hatch and then it would go above the water so that they could get the guys out, but it's gonna take time. So depending on how injured the submarine is, depends on how many guys we can save. So that's the other thing they're looking at too. It's not until after World War II where you'll see the design change from it being more of what a surface ship would be like to it actually being more oblong and having more of like a half moon type front. Why the change? It's easier underwater because you can easily move through the water and it not have to go around the different crevices. Another thing too, when looking at our submarines, is the fact that for other countries, as Simon was building for them, other countries are gonna step forward and say the US, hey, look, how about we combine? And one of those countries is England. England realizes after World War I that these submarines, they're not going away. They're sticking around. So even though England doesn't like the fact, because it goes against their viewpoints of how warfare should be fought, they look at the other nations and they say to the US, hey, can we get together on this? The US, of course, will say, yeah, sure. And so they will form that bond in submarine building that continues to today. Another thing they're gonna look at, is the fact that with these submarines, as they're being built, the fact that you have to come up so often isn't that great. After World War II, there is an officer named Admiral Rickover. And Rickover will look at this and say, okay, is there a way of moving us in a new direction? Because with our submarines, if we're still having to rely on diesel, batteries, and electricity, we can't really go for long periods of time. We have to really look at the resources around us. What was one of the major impacts of World War II when it came to warfare?
Nuclear power.
Exactly. And so what Rickover is looking at is he's saying, okay, what if we were to take, we've seen the negative effect of it. And we know that the Army has been using it. I don't know if you've ever been out to White Sands in New Mexico, but there are places there where they did release the bomb and then have the soldiers actually walk to it. And it was these test sites that they do. So the Navy said, what if we could actually take something that's negative and make it a positive? And so in working, Admiral Rickover was going against others like Nimitz and higher ranking officials saying, but we've always had diesel, we've always had electricity, we've always had batteries, we know how they work. And Rickover was like, but by going the way of nuclear power, it will be better because we can stay underwater longer. We don't have to worry about the constant need of resupplying. And this resource is going to last decades. So it's less waste. And if you have the chance, you can go on YouTube and actually see him explain to a group about how the nuclear reactor will work and how he actually has a thing over the reactor that would ensure that the sailors would not be exposed to high levels of radiation. So if you get the chance, it's a really interesting, it's about 4 to 9 minutes. But he does a wonderful job in explaining that. And it's gonna take time, but eventually the Navy will say, okay, let's go for this. And what also is gonna set the Navy in this way and set the US in going in this pattern of going for something new and different is the fact that what's going on between 1946 and 1989. Cold War. What do the Soviets do? What do they launch in the sky? Sputnik. So the Navy is looking at saying, okay, if they launch Sputnik, we got to do something else. And so Rickover will actually truly work at getting Congress and the other higher officials to look at nuclear power. That's where we get the Nautilus. And the thought was, okay, we'll make this nuclear powered submarine, but we got to try it out on something. So they said, okay, let's have ships actually been to the North Pole. Exactly, they have. If you read stories about wooden ships getting stuck up in the North Pole in the 19th and early 20th century. So we've always known what's on the top. But what's the difference between the North Pole and the South Pole?
Water.
Hmm?
Water versus continent.
Exactly. Exactly. We've never seen the underside. So that was one of the things that the Navy said, okay, with the Nautilus, what if we were to go underneath the North Pole? And then we'll wind up in England. And we'll be able to say, hey, we have the first nuclear submarine. And again, as this is going on, one of the strongest characteristics Rickover has is this attention to detail. Just like these other inventors, like Simon Lake, John Holland, and Bushnell, they were so in tune with that attention to detail that for Rickover, as he is encouraging the Navy to switch over to nuclear power, he is making sure that all I's are dotted and T's are crossed so that the safety of those on board will be at the best levels possible. So with all of the work Rickover is going to do on that, he will actually basically pave the way to the fact that to this day, our submarines have never had a nuclear accident or any type of mishap because of what Rickover and Store basically put into play, so that nothing could cause a domino effect. If you were to look at other countries like Russia, they have had numerous problems with nuclear power because of the fact that they didn't keep those guidelines fully checked, fully in place. And so with Rickover, as he switches us from the diesel to the nuclear, he really put us into a different realm. And right now, do you think other nations still use diesel? They do. Recently, Australia went to the UK and said, look, we've had diesel subs. We're getting really nervous with what's going on in the South Pacific. Can we get some of your submarines? And the UK said, well, we're actually building with the United States because we're all part of Electric Boat. So I don't know if in the news you ever heard of AUKUS. But AUKUS was something that was put forth, meaning Australia, the UK, and the US.
The Trump is trying to decide whether to eliminate.
Hopefully not.
It was in the news in the last few weeks.
But that's what we're currently working on, is the fact that we actually have Australian servicemen coming to Groton, Connecticut Submarine School to learn how to work with nuclear submarines versus the diesel ones that they've had. And then eventually the thought was, once they've gone through our school, some of our guys would go over there. So we'll see if that happens. But again, Rickover really getting this ball rolling to get us over to the nuclear power and to really show its efficiency. There have been other things. He actually created a nuclear power plant. Again, to really try to show, you know, when we're looking at, do we have coal? Do we have gas? Do we have this? Nuclear power, it's a double-edged sword. Because on the one hand, it's the cleanest and most efficient, but on the other hand, we've seen the effects if it's not taken care of properly. So Rickover will really start those discussions that we're still having today. And for our Navy, with what Rickover was able to do, is really kind of the last of these inventors that was able to take something, bring it to that next level to make it efficient. Do you guys have any questions?
Thank you, Jeff.
Yeah.
Great talk, thanks very much.
Oh, thank you.
Served on submarine named after the King of Hawaii, Kamehameha.
Oh, cool.
It was one of the 41 Freedom Cold War boats. And there were other things that, that came about by being able to stay underwater, like what do you do for air? Well, what we did is we had a 8,000 gallon a day still back in the engine room, and it took seawater, steamed it, the condensate ran down the outside and it became fresh water. And we dumped the salt water over the side. Then we ran it through a demineralizer to take everything out of there but the H2 and the O. And put it into another machine, which was way more dangerous than all the rockets we had, called the oxygen generator. And we got rid of the hydrogen with, we took water, applied a lot of electricity, and it separated into H2 and O. The H2 we let over the side, and the O we compressed into bottles back in the engine room. With all that technology, came down to a little cardboard dial. Like, how many people are up? Third of the crew, half of the crew, the whole crew, and you just open the valve to bleed the oxygen into the air system, and you didn't need to come up. You didn't need to come up at all. And the boats they're building today, the Virginia boats, I'm sure, as you know, they have a plant that's gonna run for 25 years. They will never refuel. Never refuel. And that, to me, when frankly, they're talking about building 400 windmills in our front yard, that sounds like a way better plan. But that's just my opinion. But I had a good time. I learned a lot. You know, I went off to college to study engineering, and they wanted me to take English and history and everything else. So I left after I met the girl who is now my wife. And she said, we're not getting married till you get off that damn boat. And I went to sea for a while, and, you know, we went out and made patrols, 70 to 90 days at a time, left from Spain, went out, came back, there we same the place we left. Could have gone a mile and sat on the bottom and nobody would know. Except we weren't. And we brought a lot of food, 3 tractor trailer loads full of food for 120 guys. And the boat carried, our boat had the last of the Polaris missiles And then they converted it to Poseidon. The next one after those were Trident, they were too big for the boat. Based on diameter, which determines whole size of the submarine is based on all the dimensions that it takes two rockets to sit by each other and do. The rockets were pretty impressive, you know, they, generate a bunch of steam and it pops it up, out the eggshell, through the water, pops up on the surface, and I'm sure you've seen it, then it lights off like a skyrocket and takes off. Those were great, but we had to get pretty close to the target to actually hit the target. Because we're talking about a war machine. People ask me, oh, can you see the fish? No. It's made out of, well, we used 6-inch steel. Now the new boats use 8-inch steel, 8-inch thick steel that they weld. So it can go deep enough. Yet 1,000 feet is a long way down. That's a long way down, and you have to recover, and nothing moves very fast. There's a lot of interesting stuff. In a year, I learned more than I knew I would ever learn in engineering in college. And, I was just a lonely radio. You imagine the guys back in the whirligig thing that's going back there, you know, I was a color up and around in front. It was good, and you know, we won that war and we never fired a shot in it. Let's hope the Virginians have as much fun. Anyway, I'm Chris, I live in Providence.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
That's excellent.
Alrighty, so any other? Yeah, so what they'll do is, they'll actually have different areas, so they have like Newport News, Groton, Quonset Point. When they were building the diesel subs, they actually had a place in Manitowoc, Wisconsin. Because the thought is, if you have multiple places where you're building the different parts, it's actually safer than having it done under one roof. Because if you have everything done under one roof, what does the enemy have to do? Exactly, but if it's in multiple different places, higher the chance you can still be able to get your production done. So pretty much everything is put together in Groton, but so all those parts, kind of like Legos, they just will be brought in, and then from Groton, the submarines do go out. And they have their ceremonies, so for example, when they're getting ready to go out, they'll have their christening, and that'll be done right at the Groton Naval Yard. And then, once the christening is done, then, the submarine goes underway. And then when it comes back, it can go directly back up to the base, which is next door to the museum, the New London base, or where they can work on the submarines there. Sometimes we'll have other countries bring their submarines up to our base, so we can help them out too.
If you ever get a chance, take the tour of the novels, Groton, Connecticut. Very informative. Well, I had that, had a chance today, so I was really a friend, tour. So it was very impressive. Well, job I had took me to different parts of the country. So we're in San Francisco, and there's an American World War II version of a sub. And that was it. And the guy I was working with, he had been a 19-year-old kid on one of these subs himself. And some of the things I remember telling me was that they had to train in their position to a blindfold. That's what people in power. But it was. Well, there was an old guy sitting in the little galley. He was retired. And CEO. And he had been on subs for like 20 out of his 30 years. So he was well information. And then, a few months later, I was in San Diego. And they had a Russian subject, which they towed down from, someplace up in Siberia. Things weren't so bad between, the US and Russia. So they took out the, it was not nuclear, it was, probably diesel. So I went on a tour of that, and oh my God. It was like, it's hard to describe it. It was kind of a pewter green color of everything inside. And just antiquated compared to just the stuff that we, just the, San Francisco. So there's no comparison to this. So when the comment was made about the Russians having problems with the submarine, I can see why. It's just antiquated, faulty. It's like that. I'm sure it's way away from what it's from the new facility. Just didn't have. Literally, here was boats coming. That was something, yeah, that was, the guy who was the tour. Yeah. Yeah, but just to have that comparison, I thought it was pretty unique. If you ever get a chance to talk to somebody who's one of these stuff in the South Pacific, World War II or that.
Just want to understand, how would I was trying to stay in such an open space for 7 years or 6 years?
We started with 6 classrooms full of students. And in 2 weeks, there were only 4 classrooms. And by the time we graduated, there were 3 and a few spares. All the normies get fed out, and the rest of us stay here. And you have to be slightly etched to live in a submarine. Because everyone is. And it helps you fit in. I'm telling you, it's like a jig puzzle. They drop you into this boat, and you know, okay, we're leaving in 3 days, and I'm gonna be in here for, till the next quarter. It's not too bad. Everybody knows what they're there for. Everybody is highly trained. What was the quote I heard once? Oh, it's submariners reunion is like a Mensa meeting at a biker bar. Geniuses. No. You ever been to the sub cafe in London, yeah.
And the other beautiful thing too is with the fact that when you look at the different services, Army, Navy, Air Force, the beautiful thing about the Navy, especially with submarines, is for those guys that get out of the service, they have a job that they can easily go into. So if you're a welder, then you can start your own business for welding, or you could go work at places like Electric Boat or other things, same with electricians and so forth. So it's nice, it's that easier transition compared to if you're in the Army or the Air Force, it's a little bit harder with the transition.
Quick question, how do they all end up in Connecticut? I just out of interest, started things wrong.
Yeah, so like for Bushnell, he grew up there. For Simon Lake, for him, even though he was from New Jersey, it was cheaper in Connecticut at the time, so that's how he got to Milford. For John Holland, he had started his business in New York. And then when he combined with Isaac Rice for General Dynamics, I think it was just more of a easier place, like, okay, geographically, this is gonna be a little bit cheaper than keeping it down in New York. So I think it was just more that. And then the nice thing is, when you look at it from like the grand history perspective, those who live in Connecticut could say they have all the successful inventions. So.
Samuel, yeah. Yeah, right.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Megan.
You're welcome. Yep, we look forward to having you. Always look at our website. USS Nautilus, dot. Huh? .org, that was .org. But yeah, just look us up. We're always doing events. We're looking at celebrating the Navy's 250th anniversary in October. In the summer times, on Saturdays, we have different lectures for our lecture series, if you ever want to check that out. So yeah, we're always doing something. Would be a pleasure to have